The final skill of heeling will consist of, having once found this position, remaining in it no matter what the handler does. Thus, heeling is a passive exercise. The handler begins the leg-finding exercise by placing the dog in a standard starting position, stepping away from the dog with the hand in the dog's collar and turning about 90 degrees towards the animal. The best way to orient ourselves to this starting position is to look at it from overhead in terms of the footprints of the handler and the dog. The dog and the handler stand facing the same center point, but at a 90-degree angle to each other. A line through the dog's forefeet describes his starting position, while a line through the handler's feet describes the finishing position. The place where these two lines intersect we will call the apex. The objective of this exercise is to cause the dog to move into heel position in a particular way. Ivan does not want the dog to step forward to the heel position. He does not want the dog to move his head and forequarters directly at the handler. The leg-finding exercise is used to teach the dog a stereotyped movement, a way of moving to heel that will minimize problems later on and maximize the dog's chances of performing correctly. Ivan wants the dog to move to heel without crossing either of the two lines we have described, by going around the apex. The prompt that causes this movement to occur is traction on the dog's collar by the handler, who closes and twists his hand in the collar in such a fashion as to cause the dog to step sideways around the apex and into heel, if possible leading with his flank and hindquarters rather than with his head and forequarters. What happens next occurs in two stages. First, the handler moves the dog broadside to his leg while extending his leg back one full step behind to exaggerate the position. This teaches the dog to completely bend his body and fully move back and then turn into position. Once reaching this position, he will be released and rewarded. It should be noted as well that the dog is being rewarded for this movement, not for sitting after reaching his position. Once the dog understands this procedure, he can be asked to sit, and we're ready for the second phase, all the while using as little pressure on the collar to elicit the desired movement. The handler will then ask from this position that the dog move forward, following the leg into a more proper finish position. This procedure is done in two stages until the dog is fluent, and then, and only then, will the dog be asked to find this final position without the aid of finding the leg in the first position behind the handler. During this leg-finding exercise, it is not important that the dog make one- or two-way eye contact with the handler. Attention, remember, is controlled by a separate command and can be re-established at any time by working with this command. As the dog begins to gain fluency in this exercise, he will begin to show anticipation. As a result, the handler can fade the prompt, helping the dog less and less. Gradually, the arm movement involved in reaching to the dog's collar and drawing him over to the leg will take on the nature of a gestural command. This gestural command will be gradually reduced until finally the finish to heel comes under control of voice command alone. Once the animal finds the leg easily when the handler stands normally, then Ivan will strengthen and crystallize the concept of heel position for the dog. He does this by asking the dog to find the leg and correct heel position no matter how the handler stands. In addition, he must learn to follow this leg no matter where it goes, whether one step forward, one step back, or one step to the side. Now, the leg-finding exercise is not only the method by which Ivan teaches the dog to finish to heel. It is the single most important tool in teaching the dog how to move at heel. Once the dog understands exactly where heel position is, has learned to use the position of the handler's left leg only, and has mastered the gymnastic skill of swinging his hindquarters into position, it is a relatively simple matter to teach the dog to maintain this position even when the handler begins to move. The next step in healing is to put attention and the leg-finding exercise together. The handler finishes the dog and then asks for one-way attention. Then the handler steps forward with the left foot smoothly and slowly and begins to walk. If the dog has more difficulty with attention than with healing, then the handler gives the watch command first. As the dog steps forward with the handler to follow the leg, remaining in attention, the handler can encourage him with the good command. After just a few steps of attentive healing, then the handler releases the dog and rewards him. Once the dog is maintaining one-way attention during the transition from the halt into motion and healing correctly for a few steps prior to reward, then Ivan introduces the halt. The handler halts by planting the right foot and bringing the left foot up to meet it. If necessary, the handler can command the dog to sit as he comes to a stop. Once the dog is stopping and sitting automatically, then the handler begins halting with his left leg in a variety of positions, in advance of the right leg, behind it, at an angle to it. The dog's job always is to find the left leg and sit in proper orientation to it, regardless of where the other parts of the handler's body are posed. If the dog places himself incorrectly, the handler will tell him no, correct him into position, and then immediately ask the dog to perform this halt again. If the animal's performance is correct, then he is released and profusely rewarded and praised. Once the dog becomes more fluent in this exercise, the handler will find that it is no longer necessary to correct the dog to heel. The dog will self-correct when he understands he has made a mistake. The handler need only to tell the dog no and heel, and the dog will move into correct position. At this point, the handler can encourage him for correcting his position by saying good, but the dog will receive no release and reward. The only way the dog can achieve the reward is by performing the skill correctly on the first opportunity without corrections, help, or recommand.
Watch me.
Turns while healing are merely an extension of what the dog has learned during the leg finding, short healing, and halt exercises. Ivan concentrates on the left turns because in order to correctly turn left, the dog must remain conscious of the location and orientation of its hindquarters, and it must be prepared to swing its hindquarters toward the handler in order to maintain station with the left leg. Once the dog is fluent in his skill, right turns are elementary. In order to understand Ivan's method for teaching the left turn, we must again draw figures on the ground in the form of two perpendicular intersecting lines. It is easiest to think of them as lines on a compass, and we can thus label the corners of the intersection northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. Handler and dog begin facing north, with the handler to the east side of the north-south line and the dog to the west. If both dog and handler work correctly, then both parties will remain on their own side of the north-south line. Handler and dog proceed north with the dog in heel position and making two-way eye contact with the handler. The dog should halt on his side of the north-south line in correct position and in two-way eye contact. Then with the command heel, the handler turns slowly left. The dog must stand and move retrogradedly, swinging his hindquarters to its right and stepping backwards at the same time. The dog will move through the southwest corner and into the southeast corner and sit squarely at heel. If the movement was correct, the handler then releases and rewards the dog. Once the dog can easily and correctly make the retrograde movement from the first halt to the second, then the handler need no longer release and reward the dog after the second halt. Instead, he can recommand the dog to heel and move off with the dog in position and in two-way attention for a short distance to the east, and then release and reward the dog. When the dog has mastered this entire evolution and is executing it cleanly and in attention, then the handler begins to move more quickly and fluidly, eventually omitting the two halts, so that the eventual result is a left turn in which the dog maintains perfect station with a retrograde movement as his handler turns toward him. For the left about turn, it is only necessary for the handler to rotate further and demand that the dog make a more extensive retrograde movement. Subsequently, he can be taught to perform left and left about and right turns while maintaining one-way eye contact with the handler. At this point, we will see that eye contact, rather than being an additional responsibility for the dog, is actually an advantage. As we all do when walking through turns, Ivan looks where he's going as he walks a heeling pattern. This means that when he executes a turn, he first turns his head and eyes to look in the direction that he will go, then the shoulders and body turn, followed by the hips and feet. A dog that is attentive and watches his handler's eyes and head will be able to anticipate the turn and execute it more correctly than another dog that is not as attentive.